We start the scene now. And I will just check.
Hello.
I will be doing the.
We are live.
Sorry, did you, because I couldn't join before, so did you say something about questions, how you wanted me to communicate you?
We will have you just go through, like, monitor the questions that people ask, and then have you read them after the talk.
Or give
Okay,
the, or give the, and
as you
when
prefer.
you go, and when you go to, oh, we have only 20 attendees. Nice.
This is,
You can as well, if
we're just starting
click,
figuring out how to do things virtually.
Sorry.
God.
I'm gonna bring you all along in this process.
So I can, yeah, tell me.
You can, so some of the question, we can as well unmute the attendees so they can speak directly, that they can ask the questions themselves if they want. If they don't want, well, you can read the question yourself.
Okay.
So hi everybody, welcome again. Oh, sorry, Matthew, that's your job.
Hello everyone, welcome. This is us a little bit behind the scenes, getting this kind of virtual thing to start. Did you want to wait till 8:05 again? Or?
Yeah, let's wait that we can wait that everybody is trying to come up with a beer, with their nice seat on connecting.
Yeah, so we're gonna give it a couple minutes, make sure everyone has a chance to connect, tell your friends, grab a tasty beverage, grab a snack, find a good comfortable spot on a couch or a bed or wherever, and we will chat with you. We'll just get this program started pretty soon. A couple minutes.
Or I can just, oh, he's left. Okay, 27. So in the meantime, we can just explain. So you can write your question. In the below, you have a Q&A section where you can write a question. So for instance, just write anything from just a test. And you can as well, when you go to the Q&A section, you can upvote if you think some of the questions are more worth than the others to be asked. So that's where the one will be asking the priority. And if your question is selected, you will be invited to actually unmute yourself so you can directly ask your question to the speaker. Otherwise, you can as well communicate with, you can send a message in the chat, or if you don't want to write, you can raise your hand at the end after the presentation of each speaker during the 10 minutes. You can raise your hand, as I will do it now, for instance. Yeah, I don't know if you see, and then we will see that, and we can give you as well the opportunity to ask your question. And for that, you can, if anyone has a question or comment, please write in the chat. So I will be behind the scene trying to set up all the technical trouble, while Lavinia will be the one monitoring the question, and Matthew will be the host of this event. And the speakers as well, if there is many more questions than the time allow, you can answer the question in the chat, in the Q&A section afterwards. Matthew, would you like to make the introduction to Pint of Science, or do I have to?
Yeah. All right, I think we can get started.
Yeah. So that
everyone's here, and everyone's got a beverage. Everyone's comfortable. Welcome to Virtual Pint of Science Norway 2020. If you were with us last night, welcome back. And if you are new to Pint of Science, thank you for joining us for the first time. This is the first for a lot of things. This is the first festival that Pint of Science Norway is hosting. This is the first time we are doing this virtually, or I guess the second night that we're doing this virtually. For those of you who are not aware, Pint of Science started in 2012 in the UK. A couple of postdocs were thinking about how they wanted to share their science with the world and didn't really have a format to do that. and decided to start going to local pubs and sharing, talking about their science. And that grew and grew. And by 2014, there was a whole festival. And it's been growing since then. It's currently over 400 cities, 30 countries. And the goal is to bring science out of the lab and into the pub. So we're not all scientists. We're not obviously all doing the same science. And lots of us are not scientists. And it's really great to be able to get to hear about all the really cool research being done. So that's our goal tonight. We get to do it virtually so people around the world can hear about this. And we have some wonderful presenters tonight. We have Larissa Mendoza, who's talking about when did art start? And we have Elizabeth Velecki talking about what does color tell us about our history. I'm Matthew Davidson. I'm a retired darts coach for cyborgs and currently a science writer. I will be hosting. With me tonight is Thibault, who is the director, the president of Pint of Science, and Lavinia, who is going to be monitoring all the questions and making sure that that part of the night goes smoothly. Tonight, we're going to do a little bit different format than last night. We're going to have each of our speakers give a 20-minute presentation, and then after both of them have spoken, we are going to have questions and a discussion session. And then after that, after we've had time for that and the discussion, we'll have a couple closing remarks. And then we will have a second session tonight starting at 8 o'clock Norway time. So that's mean time +2 for everywhere else in the rest of the world. So please come back and join us again, because we're going to be talking about Vikings and Mars in the second session. So that's all I wanted to say. I'm going to let Larissa start talking because she's got some really interesting stuff to say. She's a postdoc at Bergen in the Department of Social Science and the Center for Early Sapiens, and she studies where art starts and how we can use that to understand the evolution of human cognition and culture. So Larissa?
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Let me share my screen.
While you're getting that started, please remember, if you have any questions, type it into the Q&A box, raise your hand if you want to speak, and we'll collect all those questions and have a discussion and answer them later.
There we go. So, okay. So thanks, Matthew. First of all, thanks to the organizers for putting this festival together despite the circumstances. And it's a bit unfortunate that the first time in Norway, we cannot be in an actual pub sharing a beer. But yeah, virtually it's also fun. And I hope everyone enjoys these talks tonight. So as Matthew said, I am a postdoc at the Center for Early Sapiens Behavior and the Faculty of Psychology here at the University of Bergen. And I am a cognitive psychologist, which means that I look at evidence that can tell us anything about how we can reconstruct the evolution of the human mind. And in this case, we are going to talk about how we look at archaeology. And one of the things that can tell us something about how the human mind works is visual art. So for cognitive archaeologists and cognitive scientists, it's really interesting and important to know when art started and ultimately why. So if you go to just your regular art history textbook, what you will find there is that it is said that art started around 30,000 years ago in Europe. And one of the earliest examples of visual art in these books is the cave paintings of France and Spain. This is an example here, Chauvet Cave in France. It's a beautiful cave with paintings of animals. And from there onwards, we find more examples of different caves, the most famous, Lascaux, Altamira. And well, until very recently, that was the official story, because that's basically what the evidence told us. So we found the earliest examples of art in Ice Age Europe some 30,000 years ago. And that sort of posed sort of a puzzle for researchers, in the sense that we know our species is some 200,000 to 300,000 years old. So it seemed that there was nothing, a void basically of art behavior. And suddenly, around 30,000 years, you have art. And it seems that it appeared suddenly and out of nowhere. And that became like a huge puzzle for researchers. And that has led to many ask, how come that art suddenly started? And there are a bunch of theories that I will not discuss now. But actually, some 20, 30 years ago, researchers started wondering whether this was right. And they started asking questions like this. So was there actually anything like visual art before the Ice Age paintings? And also, if there is anything and we don't find images, and how can we tell that this is actually art? So I mean, to answer the second question, we just have to look at how we perceive art today. So if you go to your regular local contemporary art gallery, I don't think you would expect to find like a classical portrait. You know that you would be able to find maybe an object or film or an installation. So we have a very broad concept of art in the present, so there is no need to restrict art to image making in the past. So actually, we use a broader concept of art. We can include certain practices like body art, fashion, and design. And these three different visual art practices are actually the most universal one. That means that they are found in every culture around the world and in all times. So every historical culture known has these different behaviors. And another thing that people started wondering was, like, if our species actually started out in Africa, wouldn't we want to look there for evidence of the earliest artistic behaviors? And lo and behold, what we see is that if we look a little bit further than what the usual, like the classic official story tells us, we find that, remember I said the earliest cave paintings in Europe were like 30,000 years old. Well, 100,000 years earlier than that, we find some evidence in Africa of artistic behavior. And what do I mean by that? So we see that as early as that, humans started doing something that no other animal does, and that none other human species before us had done. And that is using minerals to create pigments. And we don't really know what they were using them for, but we suspect strongly that they were using them partly to paint their bodies with the pigments. I'm not going to talk too much about this tonight because Beth, my colleague, will be giving the next talk, and she's an ochre specialist, and she will tell you all you need to know about ochre and how it's made and what it's made for. But I'm just going to show you a little bit of the evidence that I'm talking about. So there's actually older things than this, but for now I'm going to just show you these few examples of what I mean with this. So we find that humans are starting to look out and collect these minerals and actually work them into pigments. So there's examples from Africa and also from the Levant, from Israel specifically. And tonight I'm going to focus on this site, Blombos Cave in South Africa. As you can see, it has a very early date of 100,000 years ago for the use of ochre to make pigments. And there are two reasons why I'm focusing on this site. The first is that actually the director of our research center, Professor Chris Henshelwood, and our team at Sapiens have been working there, excavating there for over 20 years. So that's the first reason. And the second is that it is an actual treasure trove for cognitive archaeologists and people interested in the origins of art. And you will understand why during this presentation. But first, let's go back to the ochre. As I said, Beth will talk in much more detail about this, but just to give you a quick example of how we know that humans were using this to make pigments, where in Blombos Cave, they have found, for example, this little shell. Well, it's not so small, it's actually like a handful abalone shell, where people were actually crushing the pigments, crushing the minerals into pigments and preserving it there. So that's how we know. It's very clear in this example that people were actually making red pigments with the minerals. So we have the first, let's say, art-like behaviors, which we suspect is body painting. And then we have body ornaments. So around 100,000 years ago, we see this other trend of people starting to use body ornaments. And what do I mean by that? Specifically, shell beads. So again, interestingly, in the Levant, again in Israel, and also in Africa, so all the way from the north to the south. So we have these examples from Algeria and Morocco, and again from Blombos Cave in South Africa. We see that people are starting to collect these small shells and wearing them as ornaments. And how do we know that? Again, because some of these shells actually have natural perforations. So how do we know that people were actually not eating them or something? So our colleagues at Sapiens have looked at the shells found at Blombos, for example, in minute detail, as you can see here with the microscopy and other techniques. And they have come to the conclusion that some of the shells were actually perforated by people, so the holes are man-made, and they show actual traces of having been hung in string and worn. So yeah, that indicates that they were displayed, probably in the body as jewelry, or in artifacts as ornaments, for example, could be in bags or on clothing. Some of them have, again, red pigments, which means that they were either colored on purpose to beautify them, to make them more attractive, or they acquired the pigment by contact with the skin or with clothes that were actually colored in red. So that is super interesting, and it gives an example of how early this behavior of wearing body ornaments goes. So there you go. We have I showed the examples from North and South Africa, but the most abundant and the best preserved shells come from Blombos Cave, around 75,000. And then, so we have the pigments, we have the body ornaments, and also in the same site, we have now evidence for the earliest tradition of visual sign making. So we see that people are, as you can see here in these pictures, they are creating basically drawings by incision on the surfaces of rocks. And some of them are quite intricate, like these zigzag patterns. Again, their meaning is lost to us, but it's really significant that they are using this sign. So it's a recurrent behavior. It shows that they are creating signs to communicate something. And this is the first time that this happens, especially in such a quantity and as a recurrent behavior. And we have even more interesting examples of this, very recent find of this pattern on a rock, but this time painted. So we have created abstracted patterns by incision and also by painting with red ochre. So that really shows that by then humans were using visual signs to communicate, and that is basically the basis for all representational art. So without that, we don't have the beautiful animal cave paintings in Europe. So by then, humans were already doing this. So we have at around 75,000 or perhaps even earlier, these three different behaviors. And now take into account that every time that a new behavior appears, so it's not like an upwards trend towards something. It's not that like every time a new behavior appears, the previous one disappears. Is actually an accumulation of behavior. So once people start doing something, they continue doing it, and they start doing something else, and they continue doing that. So it becomes not better, but more. And this trend actually continues today in art. So it's not like once we discovered digital technologies, we stopped doing analog art. It's just that we have an extra way of creating art. And this is how it has been always in the evolution of art. So you see that these things coexist and continue to exist together. But Blombos Cave is an actual, extraordinary site in the sense that it's the first time that we find all these different behaviors together in one place, and also so early. So as I said, 75,000 years ago at least. Some seem to be earlier. But there are other sites outside Blombos that are also very interesting. And Cliff Drift is another site that the team in Sapiens is also studying, also in South Africa. And there you can see what I was saying. So it's not like now they move on to something else. So it shows a continuation of this production of visual signs. You can see here they have found at these two sites hundreds of these beads of ostrich eggshells that have geometric patterns on them engraved. And by now they suspect that they were whole ostrich eggs that were decorated with these patterns, and they were probably used, for example, as containers for water, to transport water. That's one of the possibilities. But the important thing is that they were marking these objects with abstract signs, and that continues as before. So here we have how it's progressing from simple body painting to body ornaments to creating patterns on surfaces of objects. And then the next thing that appears, let's say in the evolution of art, of the next trend that we see, is that humans start creating beads from scratch, which is a little bit more complex than okay, it's already complex enough to find a seashell and making a hole in it and stringing it. But it seems that at some point humans were not satisfied with just using whatever they could find in nature, but they were actually looking for raw materials to create their own ornaments from scratch. So yeah, just taking, in this case, eggshell of, again, ostrich eggshell, and making them. You can see here the process, for example, of how it goes from the piece of egg to making a blank, to making a bead. And the interesting thing is that ostrich eggs are still used today for making beads and creating body ornaments in South Africa, for example, and in other places, like in Namibia. And yeah, and you can, if you visit these countries, you can still buy jewelry made with ostrich eggshell beads, which is fascinating. So there you go. So we go now a step further. So humans are making a bigger effort and more investment into their ornamentation. And now we're approaching an interesting point. Here, as you may or may not know, Europe was, for the most part of this time, inhabited only by Neanderthal populations. And we think around 50,000 years ago, modern humans, so our species, came into Europe from Africa and Asia. And yeah, and it's very telling that as soon as they do that, so as soon as we find modern humans in Europe, the first thing that we find, is precisely body ornaments. So there is an explosion of body ornaments with modern humans in Europe. And of course, here there aren't any ostriches, but there was a lot of mammoth ivory available, and they moved to this raw material and they use it and exploit it to make a great variety of body ornaments. The examples that you see here are from France and from Germany, but actually these mammoth ivory beads are found all over, from France to Russia, and they have all different shapes and sizes. And it's actually very interesting because they have seen that they also cluster geographically. So there are styles that belong to different geographies. So perhaps they were used to display like group identity and that sort of thing, as beads and fashion do today. So yeah, it seems that it's a very human behavior that, so basically humans took their tradition of body ornamentation into Europe and used a different material for that. So yeah, there we go. And let's make a little bit of a parenthesis here. We have so far still no images. And the official story is that image making starts with the cave paintings in France around 30,000 years ago. But actually, the earliest images that we have are not in painting. I already showed this, but now on purpose. So it's actually sculpture. So these are tiny figurines. Well, not actually the lion man here on the left. It's the biggest one. It's like 30 centimeters, 34. But the rest are quite tiny figurines of animals. There's some humans, like this so-called Venus. They are all from a region, actually from a cluster of sites in the region of Swabia in Germany. And they are beautiful and very detailed, as you can see here, for example, in the baby mammoth, you can see the eye and the little tail. The horse is also super detailed. So these are clearly very realistic images, but not in painting. So we don't know if by then humans were already creating also images on the walls, but we don't find them. What we find is this. And this is the earliest like art tradition in Europe. So it's actually not the cave paintings, but this is very localized tradition, but it's there. And it's possible that there are other traditions like this that we haven't been able to find or to date properly. But this is a clear example that very early on humans were already producing images. And it's interesting that they chose mammoth ivory again. So it was like the preferred material for ornamentation and for making art early on. So there we go. And now, what's happening outside of Europe? Of course, because of the, the scientific tradition of study, Europe has been studied very well and is very well documented. But again, over the past 20 years or so, people have been looking outside of Europe in more detail. And yes, seek and you shall find. They have seen that some of the art outside of Europe is actually as old or even older. And let me give you two examples. So this site of Apollo 11 in Namibia has been well known for a while. And we know that there's art there, but it has been really difficult to date. So we used to think it was actually much later than that. But recently, colleagues of ours have revisited the site and they have looked at the dates. And it turns out that it's sort of around 30,000 years. So same as the oldest cave paintings in Europe. And even more interesting, not so long ago, again, rock art from Indonesia has been dated, and it turns out to be older than the oldest cave paintings in Europe. So it is possible that there's art out there that is older than the cave paintings in France, but it's actually really difficult to date rock art for many reasons that I don't have time to explain now. But for example, there's a strong suspicion that rock art in Australia might be really, really old. So perhaps even like 40, 50,000 years old. But it is very difficult to date. However, we know now that humans were in Australia by 60,000. So it is very possible that they started creating art not long after they arrived in Australia. So stay tuned for that. I'm sure that as techniques improve, more and earlier dates will appear, also probably from India and other places. So yeah, that's changing our ideas about the origins of art, of course. So it seems that there's not one origin, that art was made and remade and discovered and rediscovered wherever humans went, basically. So there you go. Now we have also examples outside of Europe. And then finally, we arrive at 30,000, which is so far our earliest date for art in Europe. What is interesting about Ice Age art is that once it starts, it becomes more and more abundant and frequent. So this is the earliest, the famous shower cave that I have talked about a bit, and it is, you can see why it is so famous. It is impressive, it's beautiful. There are a few documentaries about it. I strongly recommend watching them, because it really, it's an impressive cave. I mean, these pictures don't make it justice. You can see, and also it gives you like a glimpse into Pleistocene fauna and Ice Age fauna in Europe. You can see here woolly mammoth, cave lion, cave bears, bison, horses. So it's an amazing cave. But anyway, once it starts, the sites become more frequent and abundant. So we really find cave paintings, again, from France to Russia, and we find other things. So sculpture, the famous Venus figurines that are also spread all over Central Western Europe. So there is a bunch of things to look at. So going back to the questions that we answered at the beginning. So were there any forms of visual art before Ice Age painting? Well, I have shown you, yes. And can we call these things art? And as I said at the beginning, yes, if we take a broader concept of art, then absolutely yes. So we can now drag the origins of art to those earliest states. So now our idea of our spectrum of art looks like this. So instead of starting here, we can drag it all the way back there. And of course, now this looks as a very nice filled in timeline, but there are huge gaps, as you can see. But I'm sure as researchers go out there and look more, it will start filling in. And it's interesting. Right now, it's actually a very interesting time. Almost every year, there's a new publication with all this, that, or new places where we hadn't looked before that we start finding things. So as I said, techniques evolve, and interdisciplinary research also sometimes helps to date, to find things. So it is an interesting moment in studying art. But well, a couple of conclusions. So basically what I wanted to show you is that art has actually a very long prehistory, much longer than we think, and much longer than is taught in these art history textbooks. And that basically, prehistoric arts in Ice Age Europe were also standing on the shoulders of giants. And there's a lot more if you just, I mean, today we just scratched the surface, but if you're interested in this, there are a lot of papers. You can look at the website of our research center, and there you will find all the papers about these artifacts of Blombos that I showed you today, and cliff drift, and there is a lot more. So stay tuned for that. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering questions after Beth's talk.
Thank you so much. That was really. I have lots of questions, so I'm excited to discuss it a little bit more after this next talk, and have a little discussion afterwards. Our next presenter is Elizabeth. She's also a postdoc at Bergen and studies pigment and rock art in Stone Age caves in South Africa. And is going to talk to us about what this pigment tells us about our expression and behavior. So, Elizabeth?
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, let's...
Oh yeah, and please everyone remember to type in your questions and your raise your hand and type the questions in, and we'll have a time for discussion right after this.
Cool, thank you so much. And thanks for that great talk, Larissa. Before I dive into this, I just wanted to say that I actually have my own little Venus replica here from the University of Tübingen. So you can get one yourself. It's still around today. It's same as it was 30,000 years ago. So there you go. Anyway, my name is Beth Felicki, or Elizabeth Felicki. I'm a postdoctoral fellow also at the SFF Center for Early Sapiens Behavior at the University of Bergen. So the same working group as Larissa. And the title of my talk today is The Past Isn't Black and White, the Role of Color in the Story of Humans. So I'm an archaeologist, right? And archaeology is the study of the past through the materials that people left behind. And I say materials because we are talking about prehistory, or essentially the Stone Age. So there were no books that we can read, and there's no written records that we can understand. So we can really only look at what people used to try and figure out what they were like and what they did. And this is why you often see us digging in the dirt, which is actually more fun than you might think, but I won't get into it that deep today. So before my talk, I would like everybody to get an image in their head of what you think of when you hear the words Stone Age. So maybe you've never thought of it before, maybe you have, but you're not sure. So either way, when we look at the way the Stone Age is portrayed in media, it often looks something like this. So you kind of have people, they're rough looking, they're actively fighting terrifying animals, they're carrying carcasses, they're half naked, they have fur loincloths, their torches, their clubs, you get the picture, right? So however, through all of this dirt digging that we do, we actually think it might look something more like this. So we think that people weren't just grunting around with a club and with rocks. So we think that they had dynamic and detailed forms of expression, right? And this woman is wearing jewelry. Her hair is worn a specific way. She is painted, she's active, and she's a she. And I think the whole picture is just more dynamic and more human and more something that we can connect with. And this brings me to my specific research topic, which is how and why did people use color in the past? So we will begin with the how part, which is a bit easier to look at through what we dig up at archaeological excavations. Also, you saw some evidence of this why and how in the previous talk by Larissa, where she showed pictures of cave paintings in Europe and the origins of art. However, I'm going to go back a bit further because in order to understand how to paint a picture or to paint yourself, you need to have paint. Now, this is where my specific research comes in because I am studying the materials that ancient people used to make paint. And these materials, in most cases, come from the earth in the form of rocks and clays and possibly plants, though these don't seem to last the test of time as well. And one of the most common and abundant earth materials that were used to make paints are a series of rocks called ochre. Now, ochre is kind of a vague term, and you might have heard it before. And I know in Norway, they have a color called ochre, and you have similar uses elsewhere, right? In archaeology, we use it to refer to any stone, rock, clay, dirt, or sediment, literally anything that has a color and can be used to make paint. And not all rocks can do this. It really depends on the type of environment it was formed in, and the minerals that are in it, and some other variables too. So as you might have guessed, these materials can be a bit elusive and difficult to identify when you are digging in the dirt, even for archaeologists who are experts at digging in the dirt. However, one feature that sort of unifies this umbrella term of ochre is that all of these materials tend to have a lot of iron. And this is the primary element that makes them colorful. And ancient humans, even as far back as 300,000 years ago, knew about ochre. So how exactly does a rock like this become paint, you might be wondering? Well, the simple story is you collect ochre like this one. I collected it. That's my hand you see in the photo. And then you grind it or you crush it, depending on how much powder you want. Then you mix it with water or fat or gum arabic, or anyone who's into art will probably know about this process. And then voila, you have paint, and you can paint yourself, you can paint a friend, or you can paint someone else. Great. So hopefully that's clear for everyone. So now we are all going to go on an imaginary trip because obviously we can't do it in real life. So this is the next best thing. And we're going to go to Africa, and specifically South Africa. And this area in general is known for being a hotspot of early humans. And this is where my current research is focused, as well as Larissa's, as well as the Sapiens Research Group in general here at UIB. So off the southwestern coast of South Africa is a site called Blombos Cave, and it's situated in a nature reserve, and you can see it here with the arrow. And it's a pretty magical place. right? I think the photo actually doesn't even do it justice. It's situated directly on the Indian Ocean. But it wasn't actually always like that, but that's a different story and we won't get into it. And within the cave, we archaeologists do what we do best, and we dig in the dirt. And through this systematic digging, which as you can see, we are pretty OCD about, we find the stuff that humans left behind. Now, I want to emphasize here that archaeology is tedious and it's a detailed oriented process. We don't simply find amazing, sensational things all of the time hiding in the dirt, right? We scrape away at the surface, sometimes 5 millimeters at a time, and put all of the dirt into a bucket. Then we shake it through a screen or a sieve. And even then, that's not all. We are then left with something like this, right? So we wash it and we sort through it. And sometimes the sorting can take a couple of days. Trust me, I know, but you actually find more stuff in these screens than you can while digging. So if you have an eye for detail and are really OCD, you should talk to us and maybe consider archaeology. But anyway, after sorting through these screens and after digging for 2 months and after for some 20 years of fieldwork at the site, then you can start to build an assemblage of something like this. Now, Blombos is pretty unique, and I'm not just saying that because I am biased. The material that we have found there is exceptional, and the things from this cave have given us a clearer picture about the behaviors, technology, and culture of early humans in South Africa. And some of these things are the first of their kind. They are the oldest of their kind, and some are quite literally one of a kind. You have stone tools, you have shell beads, you have bone points, carved shells, and this stuff has lasted in the dirt for like hundreds of thousands of years. It's just amazing. And some of these items you saw Larissa talk about in her talk. From Blombos Cave specifically, we have so far recovered some 9,000 pieces of ochre. And that's so far because I'm not even finished going through all of them yet because the fieldwork was interrupted by the corona pandemic. No big deal. But of these pieces, almost 2,000 of them look like humans have tried to get pigment powder from them. And how we can tell are these little lines you can see in the ochre pieces here, especially on the bottom left, and we call these use traces. And these use traces usually occur after someone takes a piece and grinds it against another harder rock, or they scrape it with a knife. Think of how you would sharpen a stick or grate cheese. It's a similar process, and it leaves a mark on that material. And looking at these marks can tell us a lot about the technology of humans and how often and how much they were working with these ochre pieces. So you might be thinking, how do we actually know that they were making paint with these rocks? Maybe they were just playing around and making scratches. Well, do you remember the third step in making paint, where you have to mix it in with something? Well, we found that too at Blombos. It's an ochre paint kit in the form of a haliotis shell with ochre powder inside, and it's 100,000 years old. And we found it ochre mixed with organic binders and equipped with all of the tools that artists need to make a paint, such as a bone stick to stir the material, amongst other things. So we have pretty strong evidence that people knew what they were doing when it came to making paint. Now I'm just skimming the surface here and showing you the basics. We also know that people were using ochre because we have a lot of these types of materials at Blombos. And we have found ochre on a bunch of other artifacts, like stone tools, beads, and bones. But I just want you all to understand that people in the past were making a lot of paint, and they kept up this tradition over tens of thousands of years. And while this is an interesting story, it's not all of it, because in my research, I want to go deeper. I want to know, where did people get the ochre to make their paint? Now you might be wondering, why is that important? Does that really matter? Because red rocks are literally everywhere, right? So in archaeology and in human behavior in general, we have this concept of exotic or rare items. Maybe you have something like a French cologne or ruby earrings from India, or a fine wine from Spain, or Italian leather shoes. All of these items transform because they come from a certain place, and we attach a certain value to them, even if they're not of a superior quality. And my point is that these items can transform and become more valuable when we attach certain meaning or symbolism with them. And often this is based around the distance that it traveled, but not always. And we find this in several historic hunter-gatherer groups who stated that certain materials, such as ochre, became more valuable the farther that they traveled. So perhaps this was also the case for people at Blombos. So in order to explore this, I did some hiking through the landscape around Blombos Cave. And I went to some really nice, beautiful, amazing places. And I went to some not as nice yet still okay places. And also to a desert where we almost died from dehydration until we were saved by a bottle of juice. That's a different story. But in the end, we found some ochre, and we found some really nice ochre that would definitely be good to make paint with. And I know this because I made the mistake of wearing a white hoodie one of the days, which is now covered with red, and it won't come off. So this is very potent. And I collected ochre from about 11 different spots. And so in total, I have about 50 different ochres that I've collected. And right now, I'm in the process of analyzing these ochres from this area around Blombos, so we can understand what types of rocks they are, if they're unique, and if so, what makes them unique. And usually this has something to do with their elemental content or any special things in their geological makeup. Ultimately, my goal is to compare the ochres that I have, that I collected, to the ochres from Blombos Cave. And then maybe we can learn where people collected ochre, which leads to the next issue. Because now we have an idea of how people used ochre. We might even find out where they were collecting it, but we still don't really know why. And unfortunately, there is no one answer that fits every question. But don't worry, I've been studying ochre for 10 years or something like that, so I have some ideas. If we look at it from an archaeological and experimental perspective, we see that ochre was used in a variety of settings and in a variety of ways. Experiments have shown ochre to be a good sunscreen because it blocks harmful UVA and UVB rays. And it's also a good insect repellent. It blocks mosquitoes, and it's nourishing for your skin. It's full of iron, so you can actually eat it, and it works as a mineral supplement. And people do this. And ochre is also a very strong component in hafting mixtures. So essentially, it can be used to make arrows and spears and attach stone tools to these wooden points. And it has been found on stone tools, so we know this is happening in the archaeological record. Ochre residues are found on shell beads, they're found in ivory beads, they're found in human burials, also in Scandinavia. Ochre paint has been used in cave paintings like the one Larissa showed you. They've been found on rocks, and it might not even be unique to humans. There's also increasing evidence that Neanderthals used ochre too, like the shell on the bottom right. So color and using color isn't even unique to our species. Furthermore, it's not just unique to one place. Humans have used ochre on literally every continent that they have inhabited, pretty much as soon as they get there. So we are a colorful species, and we have used color and have been using color since we've been human. And it's because of this, through studying the use of color in the past, we can begin to understand when ancient humans started to behave like us, when and how we started to express ourselves, when we developed language, when our minds evolved, and when we began using symbols. And studying ochre and the use of color is a key for us to understand the culture of humans in the past. And perhaps the thing that I find most fascinating about ochre is that it is actually still used today in so many different ways. In certain places like Australia and Africa, like the countries of Namibia, South Africa, and Eswatini, Malawi, etc., ochre is still an important component of life. You can buy ochre at a market. You can use it for medicine. You can use it for cosmetic purposes. And people in these places are using certain types of ochre from specific places for certain things. In Swaziland, for example, this ochre that you can buy at the market in the bottom right photo here is meant to be eaten or to put on your skin or for when you get married. However, this type of ochre is something special, and it is only used by specific people for specific things. Not everyone can use it because it's spiritually potent. And also, I think it's it looks amazing, but I might be biased. And the use of ochre isn't restricted to indigenous contexts either. Ochre is still being used in art all over the world in the same way that people used it tens of thousands of years ago. And I know a couple of these artists, specifically Anne and Heidi, they still go out and collect their own ochre and they make it into paint themselves. And even in Norway, people use ochre and are still using ochre for art, such as this piece on the bottom right by Sofia Eliasson, which I think had a really good title of The Vastness of Time Contained in One Color, where she had hematite or ochre from Norway and painted these walls. And my last point is that colors still hold so many meanings for us today. So here in Norway, as in many places, colors hold special meanings, such as on the National Day where you see red, white, and blue everywhere, right? Or the use of specific colors for traditional houses, or of course, flags are always color coded. And one personal thing I'm fascinated by is why black kitchens are so popular in Norway. Like, it's rain and rainy most of the year, so why wouldn't you have something bright and colorful? But you know, it's a perfect example of like trends and cultural preferences and fashion and people following those sorts of things. But anyway, my point is that color is a powerful thing. And by studying the ways that we have used color and are using color, we can learn more about ourselves in the past and how we have changed over time. So with that, thanks to everybody for sticking around and watching the talk. And I hope you enjoyed learning about color and human evolution.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to switch us over to gallery view because now we can see everyone. So this is the time in the talk when everyone in the audience gets to ask questions. We're going to have both of our speakers give responses. If you have a question for a specific speaker, mention them in your question. Lavinia is going to moderate those. I don't know if we have any yet, but while we're looking for that, I have a question. Just to get us started, I was wondering essentially what took so long to get from, just using pigments to getting to, like you showed, like the Sistine Chapel. Is it a evolution of technology in art? Is it a style, like fads in art? Like, 100,000 years is a long time. Why didn't the first people with pigments start painting the Sistine Chapel kind of things?
Should I? I mean, maybe we can both answer that, but I'll just give a quick comment on that. I mean, the thing is, because we're talking about such vast spaces of time, we're only looking at what's still here. So, I just want to, I think that there is quite a lot that we could be missing because it's just withered away. I mean, people have things here that don't last like, 2 years, like, plastics and things, like, it's just, so many things deteriorate even over 10, 50 years. So what the things that we're interpreting as art, I mean, it's really just what's left behind. So there could be a wealth of things that we're missing because they have already, gone away.
Yeah. And also I think it has to do with cultural evolution, basically, and the evolution because nowadays technology and inventions go so fast, we expect things that have been always that way. But actually, if you think about it, like, we have had computers for the best part of the 20th century. So you could ask, why as soon as the computers were invented, not everyone had a smartphone. So it takes time. So especially early on, you like most inventions have to fulfill a niche and a need. And very early on, you have to think that early human populations were small. They were small groups, mostly families, kin. They knew each other. They were moving around the environment, so they didn't live in houses, but they had camps. Sometimes we are lucky to find one of these camps where they stayed for a while, like in Blombos Cave, but most of the time, the places where they lived are lost in time. So we just have like snapshots of the activities that they were doing. But also, so image making is a very particular behavior that emerged as we saw different times in different places, but we cannot expect people to have had the need to create images from the beginning. So that's basically what your question is, one of the biggest puzzles for people who are interested in human cognition, the evolution of mind, the evolution of technology, the evolution of art. because we expect these things like, okay, once one person has this great idea and discovered this technology, then everybody should have it. But there are many things that we have to take into account, especially social things, demography, the fact that some inventions appear and disappear and then reappear again. So it is a whole topic in itself. But eventually we got there. And it took indeed some time, but yeah, I think what's important, what I tried to show, is that the capacity was already there. So perhaps the reasons why it took time to evolve into image making had to do with other things that are not, perhaps in a way also cognition, but basically those humans were very much like us. So their brain was similar to ours, and as we can see, their capacity to create and to make things was also already there. So we have to look at other types of aspects of being human to explain those sorts of questions and puzzles.
Thank you. There's a question for Larissa. One of the attendees asking why the meaning behind that type. What is the meaning behind that type of woman statue with weird proportions? So these weird proportions we saw in this statues.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Well, this Venus, the early Venus from Hohlefels that Beth also was showing. I mean, speaking about meaning is really difficult when we try to interpret these things, because on the one hand, you can say we will never know. On the other hand, we can try and interpret and learn. But yeah, some researchers have suggested that it's a sort of a mix of a person and animal. Others that it is not important to have realistic representation, but actually just the main features that represent, in this case, womanhood. And that's maybe why many of these Venuses have like exaggerated breasts and buttocks. They don't mean to represent one person in particular, but more a concept of womanhood. And this is one of the best explanations that we have for it, but we don't really know if that's the actual meaning. Maybe it's something humorous, we don't know. but we try to see it from our references, which is anthropology and theories of representation and so on. And so far that's I mean, we just, what we know for sure is that there are not many representations of humans in Ice Age art, which is actually really interesting and a whole topic in itself. But we know that whenever they represented humans, I mean, you saw the animals are so, like, we can say exactly what kind of species they are representing, but with humans it's always very schematic, sketchy. So it seems there might have been not a great interest in representing humans for some reason, or maybe a sort of taboo. So the fact that we find these conventions in representing humans in a non-very realistic way is also interesting in itself, but we don't really, I mean, I cannot tell you why. And you will find, I mean, if you look up literature, or if you just Google, you will find 1,000 theories about this. So there are many answers actually to this question, but not one that we could say, yeah, absolutely, that's it. So, yeah.
Thank you. And there's another question, this time for both.
You can bring the Easy. You can.
If Easy wants to answer.
If you unmute yourself, you can. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Great. Excellent. Yeah. So I'm cheating a bit because I'm a PhD student at Durham University in the UK, and I study Paleolithic cave art. So I found both of your talks really fascinating. And I kind of wanted to get your opinion on the recent evidence of Neanderthal art. So in particular, I'm thinking of the dates for cave art in Spain, ochre shell beads that are now dated to 115,000 years old, and how this might change your own understanding, or how that fits in with your own understanding of how these behaviors emerged within our own species.
Beth, do you want to start? It was coming.
I mean, honestly, it's for me, it's a bit of a catch-22, because if I can answer it narrowly from a pigment perspective, you cannot deny that there is increasing evidence of manganese base. So essentially black pigments are in many cases associated with Neanderthals. So especially in Western European context. So they're finding more and more sites where you can't really argue about the dates and the association of black pigments with Neanderthals. And I think for me, okay, the cave art one in Spain, that's a bit iffy, but I don't necessarily think that we need the smoking gun of evidence for Neanderthal, symbolic capacity or cognitive capacity. I mean, and also, kind of the points that Larissa was making earlier, that, we need to have a broad concept of what we're describing as art and what we're describing as symbols and these sorts of things. I mean, again, the archaeological record is biased for non-perishable items. And I mean, who's to say that Neanderthals didn't have extremely complex ways of communicating and symbolic communication with organic-based materials? So I think that you can't, from my perspective, I don't think that the argument is viable saying Neanderthals weren't capable of these things, because I think based on the evidence, we know they were doing some of the behaviors that we see, that we identify as symbolic based on how we define it. So, I mean, I think a lot of the finds, the sensationalism is a bit, kind of the focus, as opposed to actually illuminating the complexity of Neanderthals as a species. But I mean, I agree. I think that more and more evidence is going to come out, and maybe we're going to learn how to broaden our definitions and our identification of these materials. So yeah, it's not really a simple answer, but I don't necessarily agree with the assumption that, Neanderthals only had symbolic or these types of behavioral complexities only when humans came into the continent. I mean, I think, I don't know. I think that they were capable of it in their own way. But I mean, I think we might just be biased when we interpret the archaeological record. But unfortunately, I don't have the answer of how to interpret it. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Now you, Larissa.
No, thank you for the question. I mean, we actually, I had a slide on Neanderthal art, and then I took it out last minute because I thought, oh, this is like a whole thing. So we could give a whole talk on this, as you know. But I don't know. I mean, like Beth said, the fact that they did or did not have image making, for me, doesn't diminish the fact that they had a very complex cognition. I think by now is absolutely no question about it, that they were capable of language, that they had super complex technologies and social lives. But I mean, trying to impose our type of art on them, it's strange in a way, because I mean, the fact that there were species that were so close to us doesn't mean that they necessarily needed to behave like us. Like if you look at bonobos and chimpanzees, they are also, I mean, super close, and they have completely different social behavior. So it is possible that Neanderthals had other behaviors that we don't have, and they were unique in their own way. So expecting them to develop exactly the same types of cultural traditions as humans did is a bit like teleological thinking for me. So it's like expecting them to evolve towards something that looks like us, whereas they had their own evolutionary path. And so I think it gets a bit philosophical there when we talk about Neanderthal art, but in a way it is, because it's like trying to impose our way of thinking on them. And but absolutely, I mean, were they capable of creating art? I think so. I mean, as Beth said, there's evidence that they were using pigments. I mean, creating the handprints. It seems like the hands are the best, perhaps the best, like the most reasonable and well, dated evidence for Neanderthals making some sort of something that looks like human art. The ornaments, I know, it's also like, the problem with that is for every person that says, yes, it is an ornament, you will have like 100 papers saying, no, it's not, and the other way around. So it depends on where you stand. But yeah, maybe they did, wear body ornaments, I think, perhaps. Did they have the same meaning as they do to us? That's another question. That's where I think the biggest problem lies with Neanderthals. But as I said, I mean, it is an interesting time. We see these papers and finds accumulating, and every year we have more and more. So maybe in 20 years, we'll have a very good idea of what they were doing and what they were thinking, and we will be able to answer this. But for now, it's all a bit in the air still, I think. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you both for your answers.
Okay.
I'll mute myself again now.
Thank you. Yeah.
Time for one more.
Yes, I see there's one from Thibault.
Yeah, actually, so I have actually two questions. I was interesting to know what was the place of art or the symbols in prehistory. And for instance, that Larissa, you mentioned that when you show the slide about the mammoth ivory curved pieces, that they were from the same like location. So were they used as well for trading, for instance? And the second question is for Elizabeth. Like to know, you mentioned only you focus on ochre, but I wanted to know how many colors they were using. But just like to know, compared to now, we have thousand and thousand and thousand. Just as a comparison. Thanks.
And so for me, we're about the beads, the ivory beads.
Yeah, like to show like what was art for them? Was it used for trading with just like for idolation for
that
gods or...
is actually one of the ideas that they were used for trade. But the interesting thing is that you can see that these styles of personal ornaments of the ivory beads develop in regions. So you know where you if you find one of these beads in Germany, you know it comes from France. So that's really interesting, and it has really opened up a lot of research paths for archaeologists to trace how these groups moved around. And yeah, sometimes, I mean, some people do think they were important in exchange, but we also know that they were very important for personal identity. I mean, the fact that they appear recurrently in burials, it's one of the few artifacts that appear from very early on in graves and continue to appear throughout the Paleolithic. So that means that when you died, you took them with you. So it was something very close to your identity, to your person. We see many burials of children and babies with these beads, which means that also the parents were giving the beads to the children. So it was an important part of social identity and of being a person, of being part of a group. So yeah, I mean, exchange is interesting, but also, so you can see it from both ways. It was important within the group and also, yeah, outside. Yeah, so.
Yeah,
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to compare to now.
Yeah, we know beads also now in small scale societies, they are used for exchange, but also for displaying where you come from, what kind of group you belong to, also within the group, like age group, whether you're married or not, whether you come from a certain family or region. So yeah, it is possible that the same uses were applied in prehistory to these ornaments.
Thanks.
And the question for Elizabeth?
Yeah. So just to tie into Larissa's last comment there, actually the trajectory of bead use for all of those reasons that she stated are closely tied in with what we think ochre did as well. So as used as an expression of identity, of association with a certain group or a certain social status. But unfortunately, that's a bit more difficult to test, archaeologically speaking. But your question about color, it's a bit curious, because I think archaeologically, especially at these really, really old sites, like 100,000 years ago in Africa, you mostly just see red. That is by far the predominant color. But I mean, I don't want to sound cliche when I say that there are literally 50 shades of red. I mean, even more. So you have dark red, you have bright red,
Yeah.
you have, I mean, so it's all these sorts of things. And there are other ochre types as well that contain, for example, mica or micaceous inclusions. And then those would actually be glittery. And then you have dark purple. So, ochre, perhaps I didn't mention this in my talk, but there's actually a range of colors that you can get with just this one material. So it's brown, black, red, purple, yellow, orange. But that is kind of the thing for quite a while. And you really don't get other shades until much later, but I would say the first shade outside of red is black. And you do find some evidence of this quite early on in Africa, but also quite early on in Europe as well. I think white pigments are a bit more difficult to identify because they tend to be a bit more ephemeral. But yeah, it kind of goes in that way. And what's interesting, I think, is that if you look at the evolution of language in a lot of societies, the first terms that they have for colors usually begin with black, white, which are kind of differentiated between dark and light in some cases, and then red. So red is kind of the first color term in a lot of languages as well. So yeah, it is quite interesting. You don't really get more complexity of colors until much later on. So yeah, but now we have thousands to choose from. So we're a bit spoiled, I think.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
So that's gonna wrap up our first session for tonight. We have a second session coming up. We're going to be talking about digging in lakes and finding Vikings, and also life on Mars. So stick around for that. If anyone's more interested in learning more about what we're doing, we are at Pint of Science NO. I am at MLD Sci Wizard. Elizabeth is at It's Evolution BBY. And Larissa, are you on Twitter?
No, I'm not. I will be soon.
to learn more about what you're doing. Where can people go if they want to learn more about?
Well, I had my email and the website of SEG.
Okay, yeah. So on our Pint of Science website, we have all that contact information as well. So thank you again to everyone for coming. Thank you for everyone who helped make this work, and of course, thank you again to our speakers. We will be back in about 45 minutes with Vikings and Mars.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.